Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's the 5th of May, Cinco de Mayo 2012. And I'm with Audrey Waters to talk about her post this week in hackeducation.com. Hi, Audrey.
Hello, it's been a busy week.
It has been a busy week. For me, there was a definite theme this week. I'm going to say it. I don't know that you intended it, but for me, the theme was agency.
Yes, I felt that very much as well through all of the things that I was listening to and thinking about, and just sort of the news that sort of rolled across the wire. Very much so.
It's going to come out very significantly in the posts about college, and I think in the learning analytics stories.
Yes,
Huge part of it. So you start with this fascinating post about giving up tech blogs for a month, maybe longer.
I haven't resubscribed, so I think longer.
So what did you do?
Well, I mean, I pay attention. I mean, this is what I do for a living, right? Monitor technology, education technology, specifically, but technology very closely, and that, particularly from the time I spent as a technology blogger, that required subscribing to all sorts of tech blogs, as many as possible, just to sort of know the landscape of the industry. And I had just over the last 6 months, I would say, I had sort of just reached just reached the capacity of what I could handle. In part because I felt as though most of these tech blogs, and I'm talking here about sites like TechCrunch and Mashable, The Next Web, GigaOM, The Verge. They very much just repeat what everyone else is saying. So if something happens, so for example, the Apple introduces a new iPad, everyone pretty much has the same story. And there's not a lot of depth. There's not a lot of analysis. There's just a lot of blog posts. And I decided just to weed that out of my world. I figured that I still pay attention very closely to education news, of course, but I have other ways of finding sort of the generic technology news. And I must say I'm a lot happier for it. I feel as though I'm actually reading more things that matter to me. I'm probably reading more by virtue of taking this step to sort of read less uh, read less of the technology blogosphere.
So some of this seems to me to relate to sort of personal learning styles. Like I don't do broad and wide well. I have to be narrow and deep. But it also seems like with the increase in just total quantity and volume, that this isn't just going to be about tech blogs. This is just about information in general.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, and I think that that's something that people should really think about when they do cultivate their social networks, particularly because there are more and more of these tools that help make reading recommendations to you based on people in your networks. For me, that involves a lot of following folks on Twitter. I mean, that's how I would know that something has happened that sort of didn't appear in my RSS feeds, for example. But I do think that knowing how to find information rather than just sort of opening yourself to the fire hose is going to become increasingly important.
So I read a lot of books in order to prepare for the Future of Education interview series. And I've had to justify that by saying, okay, so I'm just going to be the guy who reads more of the long form, deeper thinking and less of the kind of day to day. But with so much information, is there a change in what is being created for the web? Meaning, does this huge volume of information mean that people are actually writing differently in order to be read on the web?
I think so. I mean, and I think that that's certainly something that I've written about before too. I think that the pressure on writers, people that write for the web, to write things that generate page views and not necessarily do that because they've sort of broken a story or done in-depth investigative reporting, but a lot of times because they have sort of salacious headlines or things like that. And so and I think that people tend to write. They tend to write items that are shorter. I think that they use a lot of sort of headlines within, sub headlines within the text sort of draw people's attention so that people don't actually have to read, so that they can just sort of skim and glean what they need to from a story.
Really interesting. So you and I have talked also about sort of the need for um, supporting deeper thinking
Yes.
in writing and in curation, and we're both very interested in this. So if you're listening and you have thoughts about it, let us know. We're kind of working on trying to figure out ways to support that. Okay, so then you talk about not sending the kid to college. This is your personal as public blogging
Yes.
opportunity. Did your son give permission in advance for you to talk about this?
He did. We've talked about this before, and he was sort of fascinated by the responses, and I think it actually made him feel pretty good. He, even though I've been very supportive of his decision not to go to college, I think he made the right choice at this moment for him. He has been feeling a lot of pressure from other people in the family who aren't so certain that that an 18-year-old belongs anywhere other than in a university. And so he was very pleased to see sort of positive feedback for his decision, and he actually was sort of curious about some of the other suggestions of things that people thought he might look into, particularly some volunteering and international travel.
Well, so you probably know that our now 19-year-old daughter took a year off last year.
Mm-hmm.
Not identical circumstances, um, in the sense that she wasn't saying, I don't think I want to study in college. She said, I don't want to go next year. And our response was, just pick something to do that's worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was easy to give that response because this wasn't the first time we had faced it. This was the second child who had sort of dropped out in some way. And what occurred to me in that whole conversation was that in large measure I needed to cede control.
Yes.
I needed to be supportive, but I also needed to not try and solve. And that led me to this sort of long, deep thinking about the degree to which that we're actually exerting control when we think that we're helping youth of this age.
I think that that's really true. I mean, and I think it is difficult. I mean, it is difficult to sort of step away as a parent. I think. I mean, that's just one of I think that's just sort of the letting go of your child and recognizing that that your child is now an adult and an autonomous being that gets to make their own decisions. For better or for worse. I think that that is a difficult process, and I think it's also particularly challenging when there's all of this sort of cultural pressure that the right thing for them to do is school, and I think that I think that it's for me it's also been recognizing the way in which I think because we do control children's lives so heavily that when they are at this moment of making their first decisions as autonomous beings, it's actually I think even more of a struggle for them than it need be. Because it is the sort of the first time that they're making these sorts of, life-shaping decisions. That's true, but I'm not sure we necessarily do a good job culturally in helping prepare them to be autonomous. And I think that's why college makes sense in some ways, because it is the easy thing that you don't have to question, and you moving from one institutional setting to another institutional setting, and you're still very much cared for.
To me, it foreshadowed the conversation about big data, and I'm not sure that you meant this, but I'm quite certain that you'll find resonance with it. But we often use data, say about careers and about salaries and professions, to justify kind of a heavy hand in steering kids towards certain things.
Yes.
And it seems as though in that particular case, the data, that we often use the data for a purpose which may not ultimately be healthy. Which I don't really care what your passions and interests are, because if you don't go to college, you'll make less money. So I really want you to go to college.
Right. Right, and I think that I think that it's I think we're at a we're at this very interesting moment where there are lots of conversations about the way in which higher ed is changing, perhaps the way higher ed needs to change to adapt to a changing world, the way in which now students are really suffering under or graduates are sort of really suffering under the burdens of student loan debt. And then also this sort of even more rhetoric around the importance of a college degree, sort of the economy and joblessness, an issue for graduates and non-graduates alike. I think that it makes it I think it makes it a really interesting moment to make the decision to not go to college, partially because there really are so many opportunities and alternatives, and yet there's so much pressure still to sort of unthinkingly go from high school directly to the university. And even though my son is an adult, he's it is I think a big I think it is interesting watching him sort of have to make these adult decisions as my kid.
So jumping from the personal to the sort of highly technical education discussion, you went to this learning analytics and knowledge conference.
Yes.
You talk about this being bigger than last year. How big was it this year?
I don't recall what the numbers were, but I think that they said that it was substantially larger in size, and the event still sold out. It was in Banff last year, and it was in Victoria, British Columbia this year, and it was a really interesting event for me. It was a academic conference, so these were primarily researchers, higher ed researchers, folks, administrators and IT folks from universities, and so this was a very academic focus as opposed to, I would say, sort of industry focused event, which was a wonderful change for me as someone who spends an inordinate amount of time around sort of startups and industry people. It's a good reminder of the very different cultures between Silicon Valley and the ivory tower, if you will.
So the idea is that there's this data exhaust, right? There's all of this information about what we do that could potentially be online, that could potentially be related to learning, or we could learn from this information. So clearly there's this a huge opportunity, potentially even a new discipline, but there's kind of this dark side that I think came out in George Siemens' keynote.
Yes. I mean, I think that it is, I wrote about this, there is an interesting parallel between my attending this learning analytics and knowledge conference and the conferences that I've been to around big data, primarily some of the O'Reilly conferences around big data. The sense that we're at this new moment where it's not just that we have, in the case of big data, so much data, but we really have new tools and new ways of thinking about data. But the question I think that George raised was that despite this newness, are we really using some of these tools and really looking at the data that is really just in service of sort of propping up or locking down, reinforcing some of the things that we really most dislike about our current education system? In the case of the Learning Analytics Conference, it was really fascinating with all the talk of data exhaust that many of the conference panels still focused on data that was being tracked through the learning management system, and that's certainly not new. And to me, it's certainly not. It's going to give you a very strange picture of what students are doing, since they're actually forced in many cases to participate in that setting.
So there's some complexity here, sort of at three levels. One of which is when you have data to measure, that precise data may not actually be the best data for what you want to end up learning.
Yes.
Right? Or knowing. So that's a question. Just because we have precise data, does it actually mean that's what we want to be knowing?
Right.
The second is somebody you quote somebody as saying, "What's the role of learning here?"
Hmm.
Right? So learning theory.
Right.
And then it felt to me like the third was that you say this. I fear this is something that we're going to do to students rather than uh, for them or with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that question in particular, that's one of the reasons why I find the quantified self movement to be pretty interesting because I do think that it's, I mean, I would say on several levels because, but primarily because it is with the quantified self, you are tracking the data that matters to you. You're and you're sort of establishing what your own goals are. You're sort of more in control of the data than sort of than when it's someone else deciding what matters, someone else deciding what to track, someone else sort of using your data to sort of, although ostensibly I think to sort of help you. That's not always the case, and I think that this question of how often how often we're actually informing students of the data that we're tracking on them, how aware are students of this, of these measures, and in some of the cases, it seemed to be so shocking that students weren't aware of them. There were several papers in which people were talking about sort of creating a dashboard to be able to identify when students were struggling in a class. For example, if a student hadn't shown up over a number of days, or if they hadn't turned in assignments, or if they hadn't done well on exams, that you would get sort of like the red light, yellow light, green light dashboard to sort of show people's progress. And it just struck me as like, why don't students know that? Don't students know that if they don't show up to class and perform well, that they're going to fail? Sort of, why is there this disconnect between the data that sort of schools and administrators and teachers are tracking and students' own ability to track that themselves and decide whether or not to act upon it?
Well, you were there and I wasn't, but my answer to that would be if the data is not visible, if the signals are
Right.
not visible, then the students won't know about them. But sort of intriguingly, once they know about them, then it becomes a game.
Right.
Right. Okay. So what the quantified self is a concept that you got from Veronica Rivera
Hmm.
Paleo,
Yes.
a talk she gave, a presentation about the intersection of the quantified self movement and reflective learning. So sort
Hmm.
of using data for your own personal growth and learning, if I'm thinking
Right.
of that correctly.
And in her case, this research is around sort of workplace learning, and so giving giving workers the ability to sort of track what they're doing, but also that other piece of prompting them to sort of reflect on what they're learning. I mean, I think that again, this is sort of the danger of some of this of sort of data in general is that we're tracking on all of these things that may or may not be important metrics. I mean, and oftentimes they may or may not be connected to learning. I mean, you can sort of track how often, for example, someone shows up to class, but someone showing up to class or not showing up to class doesn't necessarily mean that they've learned something or haven't learned something.
So my first thought was that we've done a good job in a couple of areas with this kind of information. One in particular would be energy use
Mm-hmm.
and driving, right? So the electric vehicles and the information they give you back to allow you to make choices about your driving. I'm going to conserve by driving slower or whatever I'm going to do. Um, it seems like that's a clear case of our being sort of empowered by the information.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're looking for?
I think so, and I think that there have been some really interesting things too around health as well. I mean, people, for example, being sort of diagnosed with something like diabetes and realizing that they have to take control over their diet, their exercise, their blood sugar, and really paying attention to sort of the intake, their intakes and their activity, so that they can get truly, I mean, sort of being empowered to take control over their own personal physical health. And I think that there are some really interesting possibilities to have people take control of their sort of intellectual health, personal data dashboards, personal data tracking. But that feels very different than having sort of this surveillance mode where you are tracked and your outcomes are assessed by others. And when it's your doctor, and or when it's your school. It's not to say that surveillance is necessarily bad, but I think that putting it in the hands of the individual is far more empowering, and I think potentially far more transformative.
Right. So huge potential. The huge potential would be to provide the learning agent with additional tools to understand their learning. And clearly, there's
Yes.
so much here: time of day, kinds of studying you do,
Right.
a lot that we just don't even fully understand how we would measure or figure out, but probably has some measurability.
Yeah. I mean, mood. I mean, I think that there are lots of interesting things that we could track.
And also, sort of huge red flag risk factor here. I mean, that you use the word surveillance
Hmm.
is an interesting word
Yeah.
choice because, again, it's sort of this system of control,
Right.
right? It's okay, we're going to use this data to manage, and in fact, could be completely unrelated to sort of authentic learning,
Yep.
and be more supportive, like George says, of the bad things we're already doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
What a story. Okay, then you have this longer piece you wrote for School Library Journal on what tech in schools really looks like. What
Yes.
did you find?
Well, I mean, I think that really, I summed it up with that wonderful quote from the cyberpunk author William Gibson, which is, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. This was an interesting piece for me to think about. I mean, you hear so much about the ways in which iPads, in particular, are quote revolutionizing education. There's this sense of the ubiquity of mobile devices, personal mobile devices. But I wanted to take a look and see what does that really look like in the classroom, and not just the sort of the Silicon Valley classroom or the affluent classroom, but what does technology look like in rural Oregon? What does technology look like in the Oakland Public Schools? What does technology look like in Philadelphia? And although overall the statistics are pretty good. I mean, there is schools have computers, schools have internet access, but once you sort of drill down into it, you can see that we really do still have a long way to go, and there are some cases in which kids now have far better access to computers at home or even in their pockets than schools provide. And then there are many, many schools still which have neither, which have perhaps a computer lab that's still, unfortunately, most often used for standardized testing, and those students don't have access to computers at home and they don't have internet access once they leave campus. So it's really still a mixed bag, and this question of the digital divide continues to be something I think that we're facing.
I loved this story. I love any story in which Gary Stager's quote gets highlighted with a little cartoon animation, right? It's like, wow, kudos. Uh, I also really like the sense that there is a connection between access and technology and opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And I left the story a little unfulfilled, which was I don't think any of those statistics necessarily relate to quality of learning.
I mean, I think that that's true. I mean, I think that we've talked frequently about sort of this hope that putting iPads in the hands of kindergartners is somehow making, improving, again, talking about the data, sort of improving sort of student outcomes. I do think that it is about access and opportunity. I think that that is really important, because I think that we are, we certainly are seeing such a great divide between those that do have access 24/7 mobile access to these really powerful computing devices versus those who don't. That's not to say, that the access to the device makes a smarter kid or better learning, but I do think it's important.
I agree. Okay, so I really enjoyed the MITx plus Harvard equals EDX or edX, in part because you probably don't know this, but you and I had an almost identical take on the story. I got called by the Harvard Crimson,
Uh-huh.
and I said, "Oh, I just don't have time for this. You need to call Audrey Waters because she's going to have a better response." And then I almost immediately emailed back and said, "Wait a minute, I have something to say." And I said, "Oh, what I love about this is the humility of we want to sort of look at this in depth and figure out where the learning does take place rather than the hubris of
Yes.
we're going to scale and it's going to be amazing and it's going to be the best experience you've ever had."
No, this, that this is big news, and I should say that I think that this is something that isn't that surprising. I mean, you think of the way in which academic rivalry happens in this country. I am not in the least bit surprised that after Stanford's sort of blockbuster success with its MOOCs last fall, you could sense in a way that MIT's announcement, it was at the very end of the year, for MITx was rushed. I mean, they hadn't even sort of built the platform, or they didn't have any classes ready, but they were ready to say, no, wait, we're doing this too. And now Harvard stepping into the game certainly feels as though we can't let the West Coast schools and the West Coast sort of startups dictate the direction that this is going. So I think it's really interesting to think about sort of that rivalry, the difference between these startups, these for-profit startups, Coursera and Udacity, that have come from Stanford, versus this nonprofit that these two the two Boston universities have now established. And so sort of venture capitalism on the West Coast versus $30 million put in the pot from Harvard and MIT. But that being said, I do think that what's interesting here is that they are recognizing that this is something that has lots of interesting potential for research. But I think that I think we're really going to have to sort of see what happens in terms of the faculty's interest at both MIT and at Harvard, and I'm sure that there'll be plenty of student interest, but I'm really curious to sort of see institutionally how this unfolds at both of these universities.
I'm still not ready to not be thinking of this as a fad,
Yeah.
right? At the same time, I really loved the thoughtfulness of this position, which is we want to try this out and we want to figure out where the learning takes place and where it doesn't. And for me, although I waxed eloquent about this in the interview I gave, it didn't get included. But for me, it's about sort of where do social and relationships come in, and how much of an impact do they have? And how do you actually think about them in the context of this kind of massive online offering?
I think and I think that this is one of the things I've been thinking a lot about this week too. I mean, in part, sort of being at the Learning Analytics Conference, of course, I got to spend time with George Siemens. I got to spend time with David Wiley and Dave Cormier, three people who were certainly instrumental in in the case of Dave, he sort of invented the word MOOC. And so thinking about that legacy and then what we're seeing here with these classes that are being scaled and hopefully scaled to sort of massive course sizes. And I think that what we're seeing, these still feel like very institutional courses. This is very much a professor if not at the head of the lecture hall, then certainly at the control of the video camera, distributing information out in a lecture format to a bunch of students. And the size might be radical, but the I'm not sure that that what Harvard and MIT and Stanford are doing here is really anywhere as near as sort of radical and transformative as the connectivist model that David and George, for example, talked about in their MOOCs. So yeah, I think that this is certainly a big deal too in terms of thinking about now that Harvard is in the game. Sort of what will that do to make other university presidents feel as though their school has to have a presence in the sort of this MOOC madness? Because everyone wants to do what Harvard does is what so goes the rest of the world.
Lovely term, MOOC madness. So tell me about the merger of open source Sakai and JSIC.
Yeah, this is in after the acquisition of Moodle Rooms by Blackboard. I have to wonder sort of I've wondered too what's going to happen to Sakai, which is another open source LMS, and it it's hard to know. I mean, I think that Sakai is so small, and I'm not sure how strong, sort of strong. I think that the communities, those open source communities, are fairly strong, but I'm not sure how influential are. In some ways, the merger of them to form this sort of other Apache Software Foundation like organization definitely feels like. I mean, this feels mean to say, but sort of like the dying gasp of two open source efforts. I'm not sure if combining forces will do much to sort of stave off what feels like certainly an inevitability around the changing LMS space.
So Sakai's pretty much always been higher ed, right?
Yes.
So is this a question of sort of dying gasps of non-cloud based LMSs with Blackboard, Moodle, and Sakai and JSIG being all part of the same? Or do you feel in some way that Blackboard's acquisition of Moodle Rooms and support of Moodle is actually going to change the dynamic of what gets implemented at university levels?
That was also one of the interesting things to be at this learning analytics conference, but was to talk to the universities many of whom were sort of thinking through these, their LMS contracts. And I think that I'm not sure how much the acquisition of Moodle Rooms matters to Blackboard users, but it does. I do think that I do think that for folks who really care deeply about open source, having Blackboard's participation in Moodle now certainly feels odd, to say the least. And so I'm not sure if this is Sakai sort of trying to strengthen its position as a viable open source alternative. I don't know. I think it's a little early to tell in terms of that. But I do think that we're seeing a major shift away from towards the cloud, and I'm not sure that any of these older legacy solutions are going to are going to stay around in their current form for that much longer.
There is an interesting deeper story here about open source. Having given that talk at OSCON last year, it sort of feels like as a movement, at least in K-12, open source has died. And this last week I researched social voting sites, thinking about this curation topic of blog posts and could people actually vote the most influential posts, and would it be some valuable way to curate? And I discovered that most of the social news and voting sites have either gone away or seen significantly decreased traffic. Is the pendulum kind of swinging? Were our hopes really high as early adopters that there would be this enormous amount of participation, and we sort of seeing it swing back?
Yeah, I think I think about this a lot just in general in terms of the adoption of open source technology. And I think that I think that we are seeing some pendulum swings. I'm not sure I'm not sure, you see all of the moves to these different sort of proprietary silos, I hope that we swing back the other direction eventually, where people are more aware of openness in general. But I think it's complicated now too, because I think open source, I mean, Facebook is a great supporter of open source technology, and much of Facebook is written in Facebook itself isn't open source, but it uses a lot of open source tools, and it's a supporter of many of them. And so I think it's just a lot more complicated than something that's purely open source and that you can sort of roll your own and run your own. I think that the landscape has just become a lot more complex.
So we move from open source, open code being the primary issue to open data being more of an issue.
I think so.
So Richard Stallman again precedes many of us by identifying this early on.
Yep.
So I think several years ago he was talking about that. Okay, so I don't know that much about this New York City Department of Ed set of rules for school employees and social online activity, but I nearly fell out of my chair when it was indicated in one article that what this means is that these individuals, adults, can't actually participate online with their own names anywhere.
Yep.
Because that would lead to the potential of interaction with a student.
I have a hard time wrapping my mind around the stance that schools would take, that districts would take, in order to implement this sort of tool. I mean, I realize that there are quote, dangers. I realize that sometimes bad things happen. Bad things happen between teachers and students, but I'm not sure. I just don't see why locking down people's ability to communicate, by people's ability to sort of have a life online, is the answer at all. It seems very much like a sort of CYA policy, and nothing that helps either teachers or students move through this online world with any sort of transparency or sophistication. It just seems really, in talking about surveillance, it seems very controlling and very reactionary.
How are people responding? Same way you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of some of the teachers that I know in New York City that were active on Twitter, that had blogs, that now, how insulting to have to go to your supervisor now and ask permission to have a Twitter account, and to also to be able to suggest that that our lives are compartmentalized this way. I mean, there was some indication that you do your personal social media with your personal social media profile, and then you do your professional social media with your professional profile. And I just don't know if I just don't think our lives look like that online. I'm not sure how you could separate them.
I should have looked it up, but I wonder how Lisa Nielsen's responded.
Yeah, I think she has responded, and so is Jose Vilson, who's a New York City math teacher, and from my understanding, there wasn't a lot of teacher input or parental input in shaping this policy. This is very much a top-down, we've decided what's best for the children sort of initiative.
Again, you've used the word compliance, reflective of a compliance rather than an agency culture.
Right.
Right. Which I also thought was apparent in this Portland, Maine story about installing filtering software on laptops.
Yeah, I'm working on several stories. This is, I think this is an interesting question. Right? According to SIPA, schools and libraries that take federal E-rate funds must monitor the network and filter or block sort of obscene content. So nowhere in SIPA law regulations does it say block social networks. That's something that individual schools opt to do, but it's certainly not required by the law. But now with one-to-one devices and mobile devices, and with bring your own device movements as well, SIPA it's a little bit of a gray area, right? If you're filtering the network at school, what happens when students take their one-to-one devices home? I've asked the FCC about this. Our schools required to filter the device instead of the network, so that when students take their devices home, they similarly can't access. Obviously, porn is what's required, but in this case, in Portland, Maine, they can't access Facebook on their school-issued laptops. It very much seems as though we're more worried about control and less ready to sort of help students think about what it means to have a digital identity, what it means to be on the web, what it means to sort of explore things and think about their own safety and privacy, rather than handing over control of that to someone else to decide what you can and can't look at, what you can and can't share, what you can and can't say.
I have to imagine that parental pressure plays a huge role, or at least perceived parental pressure plays a huge role in these policies. But I don't want this to sound too dramatic, but I actually feel like this is a huge disservice to the students.
I think so too.
Not teaching them how to be good consumers and users on the internet means that you've taken away an opportunity to do some really important teaching.
Yeah, I think, and again, thinking about these questions of the digital divide too. I mean, for some students, it won't matter because they will have access at home, and depending on their parents' own filtering, that they would, if they have their own device and their own internet access at home, they can surf the web sort of unfettered by these institutional restrictions. But for other kids for whom this laptop is their only device, then they are sort of required to sort of play in this sort of restricted playground. And again, that feels like an important issue of access that I think is pretty troubling.
I agree. So it's the issue of access, and it's also a simple solution to a more complex problem that could really open the door to literacy, new media literacy teachings, kind of the Net Smart Howard Rheingold opportunity to really help students learn how to be a part of this digital world.
Yeah.
That just sort of too easily is covered over by something like this.
Well, one of the other sort of factoids from another study from the Speak Up report, the Project Tomorrow Speak Up report, which was released this week, they said that 30% of middle school students and 46% of high school students reported having used Facebook as an impromptu collaboration device for schoolwork. And so, I mean, this is, people scoff at this, but students really do use Facebook to talk about things other than Justin Bieber videos. They really do use Facebook to communicate about schoolwork. They aren't just using it as a waste of time to sort of play silly video games or to do things that are the things that we sort of worry about, cyberbullying and the like. They use this to talk to each other. I mean, socially, of course, and I don't think we should be denying them the ability to be social, but they actually do use this for learning. And so I'm not sure why we're still sort of caught in this sense of thinking that these sorts of interactions are necessarily dangerous or necessarily frivolous, because they aren't.
I'm sure this plays into larger cultural patterns with the adoption of new technologies. This can't be the first time. I'm imagining the telephone, the automobile probably went through similar misperceptions. Mm-hmm. But this is an opportunity to talk about the larger cultural narratives that we have around the technology. And hopefully we're not the only ones who are finding that interesting. Tell me about the cyberbullying lawsuit.
So this is, this. So a young 14-year-old was being harassed via Facebook. The parents asked the school to intervene, and the school said that they could not intervene because that the harassment was taking place off of school grounds. They asked the police to intervene, and the police, I think, said that they couldn't. And so the the parents are sort of suing. They're suing students and the parents for cyberbullying. I don't know. I don't know too many details, but certainly, I mean, I think that this is another one of these stories that represents sort of a whole set of cultural practices around turning to lawsuits to solve our problems, um, and thinking too about the ways in which we aren't supporting kids in thinking through the ramifications of the way in which they behave on the internet. I mean, I think Facebook is an easy target for this, but certainly, a little. I think sort of understanding your responsibilities and the ramifications is something, again, we just don't do because we often can't have these conversations about Facebook in the classroom because Facebook is verboten.
I was surprised by the Microsoft investment in Barnes and Noble. I'd kind of been expecting that, like Borders, that Barnes and Noble was pretty much destined for the dustbin. What happened here?
Well, this is I think what we'll see is a formal spin-off of Barnes and Noble that will handle the ebook part of the business. So the Nook, the Nook and the digital books, the digital bookstore around the Nook. What was interesting is that that Microsoft's investment, and it was a sizable investment, $300 million, also involves the Barnes and Noble College Division, which is, Barnes and Noble runs campus bookstores of some 600 colleges. So there is still this sort of investment in the brick and mortar bookstore. Yeah, on one hand, I'm not surprised. I mean, I do think that Microsoft feels rather late to the game, right? So Google has several digital or ebook initiatives. Apple, Amazon, the big companies are certainly recognize the importance of e-reading. So it feels as though Microsoft's sort of trying to buy itself some action. Unfortunately, much like you, I feel as though it's sort of it's bought a company that I'm not sure is that interesting, particularly with this juggernaut that is Amazon.
I haven't really followed the education startup incubator Imagine K-12, but so are they doing things of interest, or the projects coming out of that promising?
Well, Instagrok, which we talked about last week, the research engine, was one of the startups. So I think that this is their second class of startups to graduate, and I don't think I've interviewed all of the startups. I think that this is certainly the challenge that I recognize with Imagine K-12 is that this is very much a startup incubator in the mold of other Silicon Valley startup incubators, right? So modeled on Y Combinator, and I just don't know how much you can pattern the world of education startups after other consumer web technology companies. I think it's just a different beast. And so I think the challenge for Imagine K-12 has been sort of help some of these startups think through the business of education, let alone think through this question of sort of technology that supports teaching and learning. Silicon Valley is a strange place to have any of those conversations, and I think that does skew, in some ways, what you see coming out of Imagine K-12. The three founders aren't educators. They're a former Yahoo executive, a former Google executive, and I can't remember the background of the third person. But these are Silicon Valley. This is Silicon Valley. This is sort of Silicon Valley doing, education technology.
LinkedIn acquires SlideShare. Any sense of how that might impact the service?
I don't know how it'll impact the service. I think that this is, I think LinkedIn is a really interesting company to watch in the potentially moving into the education space. So SlideShare is a document sharing service. I don't know that I would say it's specifically education oriented, but certainly, I mean, I think it's been used by plenty of folks who've shared their papers and their conference slides, and there's a lot of data around the reading and sharing of that content. I'm going to be really interested to see if LinkedIn does make an overt move into the education sector with an acquisition of one of these startups. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, again, this question of data, I think in this case, it really is all about the data. LinkedIn is a very data-oriented company.
Lynda.com, are they kind of a subscription model for video? I can't remember.
Yes, it's a subscription service where you can sort of watch content on. I mean, it's very much workplace. I would call it sort of workplace learning. So how to use Photoshop, guides on how to use Excel, things like that. But it's been incredibly successful. Again, without any Silicon Valley funding, without any venture funding.
Lessons there?
I think that there are always lessons there. I think the pressure right now for young startups to take venture capital are huge. And I think if you have revenue and you can bootstrap your company, I think you need to sort of really think about what venture capital brings to the table. I mean, of course, money, sure, connections in some ways, particularly if you're looking at being an acquisition target. If you want to build a business for the long term, then and you have revenue, I guess you sort of think twice about why you'd want to take on some investment.
I remember being in Austin a couple of years ago and hearing the challenge to produce an undergraduate degree that would cost less than $10,000. And it sounds like maybe that's been accomplished?
Apparently so. I mean, this is, Rick Perry has challenged the university, the Texas university system, to do just that, make it possible for someone to get a 4-year degree for under $10,000. I think that this raises questions about sort of what are the hard costs? Why does a college degree cost so much? And to see, I mean, I think that we're at such an interesting moment in terms of the ability to find classes online for free. Thinking again, a degree from the University of Texas of the Permian Basin, which isn't a school I'm familiar with. Sort of what matters more, a Bachelor of Science degree from that, or a bunch of certificates of completion from something like Udacity. I think we're at an interesting moment to see what's is the worth of a Harvard MITx class. That seems. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with these sort of low cost, arguably low quality, and certainly low visibility named schools offering these cheap degrees.
I still think this is an incredible opportunity moment. I think there's going to be a large crowd who are going to follow the Ivy League players and kind of mirror process. But I think that this is a huge opportunity for smaller accredited schools to do something different that's actually valuable. And that's what I'm hoping is happening. I interviewed BYU Idaho, and I think they've done that with their learning model. And Anya Kamenetz profiles others in her book. I think there's this really incredible moment where there could be a real shift in who's accomplishing things of worth and value. Mm-hmm. Okay, I never expected to say the name Shaquille O'Neal on this show.
No, No, but I mean, congratulations to Shaquille O'Neal as someone who did not complete her PhD. I think it's pretty cool, and he's getting his PhD in an education related field. So good for him. Congratulations.
I got a smile on that because what a great way to model the value.
Absolutely.
Okay, Pew Research, more information on teens and digital media, this time on online video.
Teens, this is really one of the areas that I think interest that teens communication in the online world is really exploding. And thinking back again to Portland, Maine's decision to put filtering software. Remember, they're blocking pornography, which is required. They're blocking social network sites like Facebook. They're blocking streaming video sites. And it's pretty clear from some of this Pew work that this is a really important social space for teens online. The creating and making their own videos, sharing their videos online, and building an online identity around their video content. And so again, these moves to filter, these moves to ban and block are cutting off students' access to their community online.
Pesky faculty are the root cause of a lack of adoption of automated instruction software.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, where to go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say. There was a sort of a much touted study this week released, funded by the Gates Foundation, and released that looked at the barriers to adoption of online learning systems in U.S. higher education. And by that, they mean specifically these software that offers automated instruction. And it found, it made a lot of promises, I think, about the potentials for efficiency and improved outcomes, and noted that the standing in the way of this are faculty who aren't convinced that this is the best way to teach. So those darn faculty, if we could have we have robo graders, robo writers. If we could just have robo faculty, it would be so much easier to reform education.
I love Project Tomorrow. Their Speak Up report, it sounds like they've released the 2011 results.
There's always so much interesting data in these reports. Like I said earlier, some pretty interesting statistics about how students are using Facebook for learning. But it's always interesting. This is a great chance where you hear the student's voice, what matters to students, what they feel the obstacles are to sort of their access to technology at school and at home. And I really like this report for that reason, as you can sort of see how students are, in this case, how they're using technology to personalize their own learning, the things that they're doing themselves without instruction or being told to by their teachers, sort of go out and find what they need to know through their app, through their mobile apps, and through online video.
I was also really excited to see Google's Search Education Hub.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. How important it is to sort of do a better job teaching kids search literacy, and so Google has a new website, and it's I think a dozen lesson plans. They're aligned to the ISTE NETS standards, helping teachers think through ways to help teach students how to be better searchers. I think it's really important stuff.
Search definitely matters. Good. Well, Audrey, really, really fun to get the scoop from you.
Yes.
I appreciate your take on all of these stories. Have a great week.
All right. Talk to you next week.
Bye.